The gospel isn't a description of how we're to live our lives if we're to get the best out of them. It isn't even a set of instructions telling us how we're to live to make sure we will have a good post-mortem experience. In fact, the gospel isn't about us at all, except as a direct consequence. It's about God, about what He has purposed, what He has done, is doing, and will complete in Jesus, whom God has made Lord of all. The gospel isn't a private message addressed to individuals who want to be wise and good. And it isn't the wise and mostly correct theological formulations we come up with, though these are ways to get at the gospel and ways to give voice to its various facets. The word itself says it's good news. It's always good news. That's what the word means. It's always news, William Willimon said. It's always news because it's not common knowledge, nor what 9 out of 10 average Americans or Brits already know. Gospel doesn't come naturally. It comes as Jesus. Anyway, by the time the wise ones of the Western world in the 18th and 19th centuries had thrown out miracle, divinely guided history, and by the time that they had insisted that all religion was the result of the evolution of man's body and mind, by that time, the Bible was hardly worth the paper and ink it takes to print it. But what were these wise people to do with Jesus Christ when they had done all that? Well, they knew they couldn't simply dismiss Him, but they knew they couldn't accept Him as the New Testament presented Him. So with their newfound self-confidence, they got to work on the biblical witness. They carefully cleaned off the surface portrait. They said that's what the New Testament offered, just the surface portrait. But they cleaned that off and came back to tell us that they'd found the true and original one underneath. It turned out that the real Jesus was an ordinary but lovely human who taught very wise things and wanted us all to be nice to one another. Fancy that. The real Jesus turned out to be just like themselves. And His teaching, well, when all the myths and silly claims that His followers conjured up were thrown out, His teaching turned out to be the kind of thing that any intelligent and decent person could have agreed with. In fact, it was the kind of thing that they would have jotted down on a notepad if they'd been asked how life should be lived. You know, treat others as you would like them to treat you, that sort of thing. Well, whatever else that is, it isn't gospel. And it isn't what galvanized the early believers into taking on the world powers in a no quarter given war. In Acts 2:23 and in 36, Peter told his listeners that God had made Jesus Lord, despite the fact that they and their leaders had tried to prevent it. You must see Psalm 2 and Acts 4:23 to 28 for a development of that truth. Later, faced with something like the Jewish Supreme Court, Peter and John wouldn't give an inch. They insisted that God had exalted Jesus and made him Prince and Savior. Acts chapters 4 and 5. The heralds, whose job it was to publicly proclaim good news in those ancient days, proclaimed things they said were true and were good news. They weren't asking the hearer's opinion. They were announcing good news. The Priene inscription makes that very clear when it speaks of the Emperor Augustus. It's dated about 9 BC. It seems a fellow called Paulus Fabius Maximus, proconsul of a Greek province, wanted to honor Augustus, Rome's first emperor. His birthday was celebrated on the 23rd of September. That's the beginning of the civil year. Here's what the inscription says. It is a day which we may justly count as equivalent to the beginning of everything, whereas the providence which has ordered the whole of our life, showing concern and zeal, has ordained the most perfect consummation for human life by giving to it Augustus, by filling him with virtue for doing the work of a benefactor among men, and by sending in him, as it were, a Savior for us and those who come after us, to make war to cease, to create order everywhere. And whereas the birthday of the god, that is Augustus, was the beginning for the world of good news, same Greek New Testament word, that have come to men through him, Paulus Fabius Maximus, the proconsul of the province, has devised a way of honoring Augustus, hitherto unknown to the Greeks, which is that the reckoning of time for the course of human life should begin with his birth. That's what the proconsul had written on the inscription. You understand, the proconsul wasn't saying that Augustus was a savior if people believed on him. And he wasn't asking their opinion about the emperor. He was announcing that with the birthday of Augustus, Providence had given humanity a Savior. Same New Testament word used of Jesus. A peace bringer, Ephesians 2, about Jesus. A benefactor and one who gave order to their lives, everywhere in the New Testament epistles. This, he announced, was good news, the New Testament word for gospel. He wasn't calling for a debate, and he wasn't calling for agreement. He was telling the truth. This is how it is. Peter insisted that Jesus was Lord before the Sanhedrin, and told them it didn't really make any difference to him what they thought about that matter. Do see Acts 4, 19 and 20, and Acts 5, 28 and 29. And when Paul entered the Roman city of Philippi, that Augustus himself had constituted an imperial province, when Paul went in there, he said that God had made Jesus Lord. Philippians 2, 5 through 11. It wasn't an invitation. Let Jesus into your heart and he will be your Lord. It wasn't that. It was a counterclaim. Rome hung him on a cross as a failed rebel against Roman dominion. Philippians 2, verse 8. But God raised and exalted him to the place of Lord. Curious, a title claimed by the Caesars. God raised and exalted Jesus to the place of Lord above all kings and lords. Paulus Fabius Maximus said the coming of Augustus was the beginning of good news for the world, and Paul denied that, saying that the coming of Jesus was the beginning of good news for the world. Jesus was the true Savior, the true peace bringer, the true benefactor. And it's in Jesus that all things hold together and are ordered. Colossians 1:17. Whatever Westerners say when they or their loved ones are faced with serious disease and death or some calamity, in practice, the Enlightenment view of Jesus seems to have the upper hand in our lives. Jesus lived way back then, was a nice person, wise in many ways like Buddha, and has affected Western society in many good ways. But he isn't much help in the 21st century. And the person who isn't of much help to us, individually or nationally, can politely be sidelined. Of course, if he were doing something, it would be difficult to confine him to the little rented halls and run-down church buildings where little handfuls of people gather in a ceaseless search for forgiveness for their sins. Well, what does he actually do? Even his faithful lament often that their prayers are mostly unanswered, and sometimes they even think they're ignored. Everybody said those things in the first century before Jesus buried Rome.